Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are going to do some easy watercolor peonies today for Mother's Day, just in time. If we haven't met, I'm Viv with Art with Viv, and welcome to my channel. Here we go. Now the first thing I am doing is I'm taking a nice bright yellow, and I am just going to paint in these stamens. I'm using a number 2 brush, and that is my silver black velvet 3000S series, and it is again a number 2. So I'm just painting in the highlights on those those little fringy parts in the middle of a peony. And then I am going to go ahead with some darker yellow and just add some shading to it. This is really easy. These are really stylized. They're not meant to look realistic. This would be perfect for a Mother's Day card, or any kind of card, you know, that you want to put a nice little flower on, some nice pretty flowers. So I've gotten that darker yellow, and I am going in there and just putting those shadows in there. And let me back up a little bit so you can see what I'm mixing. And I am mixing a nice rose. I've got 3 kinds of rose tones on my palette. I've got a lighter rose tone, and then I have added some purple in with the rose to make more of a shadow color, and I am dropping that where the leaves overlap not leaves, the petals, excuse me, where the petals overlap each other. You know, sometimes I get carried away. I just say things, it just comes out my mouth. But we are talking about petals right now. So I'm adding a little bit of more pigment to that mixture on my palette so that I'll get a nice dark color. And then I'm just taking and pulling some of that pigment out toward the tip of the petal. And I'm going to continue just painting these petals as it goes around the flower. This little petal is kind of curled up, so it'll be really dark in the center. I'm going to leave that center part white until those 2 sides of the petal dry. In the meantime, I'm going to start jumping around my flower and just doing petals that are not next to each other so they don't bleed into each other. I could do like a wash of pink and then build up from there. That's another way to do this, but I'm just doing the individual petals. That's just my technique. But other people, you could actually paint the whole peony with a really, really pale pink and then just glaze up layers. So there's more than one way to paint a cat or a peony. Now I've just put in some of that pink in the little bud there, and I'm just going to work my way. And what I'm doing is I am painting the lightest areas with the really watery mix of the rose, and then I'm coming back in when it's still wet, and I'm dropping in some of the darker mixture that I've got on my palette for the shadow, and just letting the water do the work of the blending. I'm being careful not to do 2 petals right beside of each other so that they don't bleed in and cause some back runs or some cabbages or whatever you want to call those blossoms. People call them by different names. So I'm going to let you watch a little while because it's basically the same technique on every petal. I am just painting in a light glaze of the rose, and then I'm coming back in and I'm darkening up where the shadows would be, like toward the center of the flower or where 1 or more petals overlap each other. I also switched to my number 2 Creative Mark Mimic brush. It is a faux squirrel, and you see I went with a much darker in that very bottom petal where the 2 sides are curling up toward the center, and then I'm working up some other petals at the top there while they're still wet. So I'm going to let you watch. It's the same technique. There's nothing, special. We're not trying to make it realistic. We're just trying to make it pretty. So once you get that first layer of the pinks and the shadows while you're doing the wet on wet shadows, once you get that first layer down, then you're going to let this peony dry. We're going to move on to the next peony, and we're going to do the same technique on the next one. So we're going to let that one dry, and we're going to work on this one. We're going to do the same thing. We're not going to paint petals that are right next to each other. We don't want them to bleed. We're just going to try to get in the shadows and the lighter areas. I put in some really dark there at the tip of that peony flower, and now I'm just taking water and blending it down toward the center. I'm going around a petal that's actually sitting on top of that petal, so that petal's sort of behind it, so it's a darker petal. And I'm just going to continue to do that on different petals, and then come back in with some of the darker mixture that has a little purple mixed with the rose for the shadows, and just dropping that in there while it's still wet, letting the water do most of the work. And again, the shadows would be, I don't have a reference photo for this. This is actually just from my imagination, so I'm just deciding that the shadows would be toward the center of the flower and where the petals overlap mostly. So I'm not really following any guide. I'm just following intuition and where I think that the shadows would be. So I don't have a reference photo. I encourage you to use a reference photo. Sometimes I don't, and I think when I don't, that my work comes out a little bit more stylistic and less realistic. But for this, since I want to put this on the front of a card, a greeting card, I think that's just fine. But of course, it's up to you. If you want to get a reference photo and be a little bit more careful or a little bit more exact on where you put your shadows and your highlights, then go for it. I say the more that you paint, the better you're going to be at it. Don't do the things I do because I do it. Experiment, get out of your comfort zone and really learn, because the only way you're going to learn is to actually do it. That is the best way to learn. You can watch other people and learn some things, but the true deep learning that you are going to take with you forever comes from your own successes and failures that happen to you while you're painting or while you're actually doing the thing. So I highly encourage you to experiment and try out some techniques that I've shown you, techniques that other artists have shown you, because the more you try out, the more you do it, the more you fail, the more you succeed, the more you learn. You just get a really good solid foundation under you. So here we go. We're still just painting in, doing the lighter pinks where the highlights are, the darker pinks with a little purple where the shadows are. And we're trying to not paint two wet petals right beside of each other so that they don't have blossoms. I'm going to let you watch for a little bit. It's the same technique we've been using the whole time. And I'll let you watch, and I will come back to you shortly. Now, once you get that one painted, the first one should be dry. So we're going to do a technique called glazing. All glazing is when you either put the same color, you paint another layer of the same color over a dry layer. Make sure that first layer is dry before you paint over it, or you can disturb it, and depending on what color it is, it could become muddy. So this is just glazing. I'm coming back, I'm putting in some more shadows, I'm darkening up some of those areas, and I'm also adding a little bit of red, a warmer red to some of the parts. Now I've just put that paint down, and now I'm taking a wet brush and I'm just blending it out. And I have switched over to my number 8 black velvet watercolor brush, my silver black velvet series 3000S, and it's a number 8, but I'm switching between that one, the smaller number 2, and the Creative Mark Mimic, just depending on what I want to do. Now I'm darkening up those shadows. That's going to give it a little bit more contrast, a little bit more drama. Drama is always good in your paintings, especially when you're doing flowers, the way that the light just sort of bounces off of everything. I just picked up a little bit of extra paint there. Now I'm coming in, I'm doing some more shadows. What I'm doing is wet on dry, sort of a glazing. I put that paint down on the dry paper, and now I'm just taking some clean water and I'm blending it out to the edges of that petal. And then adding a little bit more pigment in the darker areas where I want some shadow. So I'm doing two techniques here. Sort of two techniques. I'm glazing on a second layer of color, and then I'm coming back with a wet brush and blending that out to the tips with just plain water so that there's not a hard edge there. While it's still wet, I'm adding in a little bit of the darker color where the shadow would be and letting it have a soft blended edge from the wetness, the wet on wet technique. So I'm going to let you watch a little bit longer. Remember, we're just doing this on dry The flower is completely dry before we add this next shadow layer. We're doing glazing with a little bit of blending out with clear water, and then we're coming back while it's still wet and dropping in the shadow. So I'm going to let you watch and I will return shortly. Now, once you finish that second layer up, I went ahead and I mixed some greens, and I just used the yellow that I used for the center of the flowers and just added some blue to it, a little bit of green to it. And I want it to lean a little bit more toward the blue, sort of a blue-green. I think that would make a good complement to that rosy color we have. And I'm actually just putting in the first layer of the leaves. I think this is going to be the only layer, so what I'm doing is I'm just filling in the leaves, and then in some of the areas where I want it to be darker, where I want it to have a shadow, I'm just dropping some of that darker blue-green in that area. And then later on, we are going to add like the veins with a white gel pen. So that's all we're doing to the leaves. We are just painting in some of the lighter, paler green. While it's still wet, we're just adding a little bit of shadow by placing in the darker greens where we want it to be a little bit darker while it's still wet, so that it has a nice soft edge and it blends out. So that's all we're doing to the leaves. I'm going to let you watch and I will return shortly. So I'm just finishing up, putting in some of the shadows in the leaves while they're still wet, just putting a little bit of darker green down there where the flowers are overlapping the leaves. Gonna finish up this little bud. I forgot all about him, so let's get that pink up there. A little bud about to bloom. I also forgot to put in that little petal there. So now I've let it dry completely. Don't do this until it's completely dry, and I'm just taking a white gel pen, or you can use a tiny brush and some white gouache, whatever you have, but I'm just using a gel pen to make it go faster. And I am just outlining all of the petals, all of the leaves, and in the leaves I am creating some veins with my pen. I'm just going to speed it up because y'all know how to trace it. Y'all know how to trace around shapes, and just put in some veins. It's not, y'all got this. So I'm speeding that up, but that's all I'm doing right now is just adding in veins and tracing around each petal just to give it some definition. Now the next step that I'm going to do is optional, but I feel like it needs a little something. But you don't have to do this part. So I've gotten sort of a really blue, almost cobalt teal looking green mixture. And I'm just going to do some patterns on some of the areas in the background. Again, this is optional. You don't have to do this part. But I just thought I would give it another color because we just have pink and green, which is a great color combination. That's a great color palette. But I wanted something else. So this is just me going off the script and deciding I'm going to try something new. Again, completely optional. You don't have to do it. I'm trying to sort of make it look like leaf shapes. Almost like hostas have those long veins like that, and some of them are sort of rippled like that. And so that's the kind of look that I'm going for. Although hostas are a lot larger, the leaves on them are a lot larger. It's just a graphic sort of stylized painting. So you don't have to put this part in. It's totally up to you. It's a perfectly beautiful painting without this blue-green sort of design in the background, and it would make a lovely card. You could even paint the background a solid color. And there you go. You have beautiful, beautiful watercolor peonies just in time for Mother's Day. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, share it with a friend if you think someone else you know would like this, and I will see you soon.